The transmission arrived while I was eating breakfast. Not a dramatic breakfast. Powdered eggs and a cup of instant coffee that tasted like warm cardboard. I was sitting in the small gray anteroom attached to the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council, 38 light-years from Earth, wearing the nicest jacket I owned, and I was scraping the bottom of a foil packet when the alert buzzed on my wrist link. Council session commencing. Ambassador Solis, please report to the floor. My name is Yara Solis. I am 39 years old. I grew up in a small town in southern Spain, studied xenolinguistics at the University of Granada, spent 6 years working as a translator for the UN Interstellar Contact Division, and then somehow ended up as the only human being sitting in the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. I say sitting loosely. There was no seat for me. Humans are a provisional species. We stand. I folded the empty packet, tucked it into my jacket pocket, picked up my datapad, and walked into the hall. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council is not built to make you feel welcome. It is a vast circular chamber, carved from the interior of a hollowed asteroid, and it orbits a dying red dwarf star called Vos Prime. The designers chose that location deliberately. The red dwarf gives off a dim, reddish light that filters through the transparent sections of the hull, and everything inside the hall exists in a permanent state of slow twilight. The effect is uncomfortable. That is the point. Young species are supposed to feel the weight of age when they stand here. They are supposed to feel small. I have been standing in this room for 2 years. I am very good at not feeling small. The chamber filled quickly. There are 43 member species in the Galactic Council, and every one of them was represented that morning. Some arrived in physical form, others as projected holographic avatars, and a few communicated through translation drones that drifted near their designated areas. The beings who filled the hall were extraordinary in their variety. Some were large, some were almost invisible without optical aid. Some moved in ways that made my eyes ache if I watched too long. I had learned their names, their customs, their histories. I had studied them the way a chess player studies an opponent's past games, not because I admired them, though some of them I did, but because knowledge is the only real currency in a room where you hold no other power. High Arbiter Vos Kalen took the central position. It was a tall, insect-like being with a body that resembled something between a praying mantis and an oak tree, covered in plates of dark chitin, and draped in long ceremonial cloth that shimmered when the light touched it. Its bioluminescent frills, the wide, translucent fans that extended from either side of its head, pulsed in slow, deep blue rhythms. Blue meant authority. Blue meant certainty. I had memorized the full Vos Kalen color emotion chart. I was going to need it today. It did not begin with pleasantries. Vos Kalen never began with pleasantries. The matter before this council, it said, and the translation feed in my earpiece rendered its voice as something between a low cello and a struck bell, concerns the continued existence of the species known as Homo sapiens, designated Earth-class provisional member, registration code 7741H. My stomach tightened, not from fear. From confirmation. I had suspected this was coming for 3 months. My suspicions had been correct. Intelligence gathered by Council monitoring agencies has confirmed the existence of a weapons research program operating under the authority of the Earth Interstellar Defense Consortium, classified under the project designation Fenris. Vos Kalen paused, and its frills shifted from blue to a deeper, more violet tone. Violet. Disapproval edging toward judgment. This program constitutes a direct violation of the Galactic Accord, Article 14, Section C, which prohibits provisional species from developing or deploying technologies capable of threatening Accord member infrastructure at interstellar scale. The hall was silent except for the quiet hum of translation systems and the faint vibration of the asteroid's slow rotation. I stood at my pedestal and kept my face completely still. In accordance with the Accord's enforcement provisions, Vos Kalen continued, this council has convened to deliver the formal sanction notice to Earth's representative. It turned its full attention toward me then. 4 of its 6 eyes focused in my direction. The frills pulsed once, sharp and bright. Ambassador Solis, you will receive the terms. An aide, a small blue-gray being called a Sheth, crossed the floor and placed a data slate in my hands. The slate was warm from the aide's grip. I looked down at the text. I read it once quickly, then again slowly. Earth's orbital defense platforms were to be surrendered and decommissioned under Council supervision within 14 planetary rotations. The 12 lead scientists of Project Fenris were to be transferred into Council custody for inquiry and re-education. Earth's population would be subject to a permanent ceiling of 800 million individuals, down from its current 11 billion, and Earth would accept a permanent downgrade in accord status, from provisional membership to monitored territory, which meant no voice, no representation, no appeal. Failure to comply would result in sanction. The Council's word for sanction was elegant in its simplicity. It meant the removal of a species from the register of living civilizations. It was a clean word for an unclean thing. I set the slate down on the edge of my pedestal. I did not let my hands shake. I had practiced this. I had stood in front of a mirror in my apartment in Geneva for 3 months, and practiced receiving exactly this news without letting my body betray me. My hands were still. My face was still. What moved was something behind my eyes, something quiet and cold and very clear, like the moment before dawn when the darkness is at its most absolute, and you can see every star perfectly. I thought of my grandmother, Elena. She had lived through a great deal of difficulty in her life, in a time when her family had very little, and the people making decisions about her future were very far away and entirely uninterested in her opinion. She used to tell me about the negotiating table. She said that when someone offers you a seat at a table but keeps their hand on the back of your chair, you are not sitting, you are being held in place. She said the only honest negotiation was the one where both sides could leave the table freely. I looked at the pedestal I was standing behind. No chair. Provisional. Monitored. Surrendered. I thought, we were never invited here to negotiate. I raised my hand. High Arbiter, I said. My voice was clear. I was proud of that. I request the traditional courtesy window to consult with my government before delivering Earth's formal response. Vos Kalen's frills moved through a brief, pale gold sequence. Gold meant mild surprise. It had not expected me to speak so calmly. The courtesy window is granted. 5 minutes, Ambassador. Thank you, I said. The council adjourned. I walked to the anteroom, the door sealed behind me. The powdered egg packet was still in my pocket. I sat down in the single gray chair, and I took out my wrist link, and I opened a private encrypted channel to Earth. The channel connected in 4 seconds. The signal lag to Earth from Vos Prime was negligible because of the quantum relay network, one of the few genuine gifts the Council had offered humanity in 22 years of contact. I sometimes thought they had not fully considered what we would do with the tools they handed us. I typed one word. Begin. I sent it. Then I put the wrist link away and sat quietly for a moment. The anteroom had one small viewport, a rectangle of transparent composite material, and through it I could see the stars. Not the faint, reddish stars visible from inside the hall, but real stars, white and cold, and enormously far away. One of them, at a distance my eyes could not meaningfully comprehend, was the sun. Behind it, wrapped in its warmth and its gravity, was a small blue planet, where 11 billion people were going about their morning routines, completely unaware that a hall full of ancient alien intelligences had just decided their fate. They were not completely unaware of everything, though. Some of them were very aware. Some of them had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Some of them, right now, were reading a single word on a secure government channel and reaching for a switch they had been told never to touch unless they received that word. I sat in the gray chair and breathed slowly. I thought about the 61 worlds. I thought about what we had built, very quietly, in the years since we learned the truth. I thought about the minute and a half remaining on a countdown that the Council, for all its ancient wisdom, had no idea was running. I reached into my jacket pocket and found the last cereal bar I had packed that morning. Oat and honey. I unwrapped it carefully and took a bite. It was dry and crumbly and tasted of nothing much, and it was possibly the best thing I had ever eaten, because I was still alive to eat it. And in a few minutes, the question of whether that continued to be true was going to be resolved in a very definitive direction. 5 minutes. That was all the High Arbiter had given me. 5 minutes was all I needed. I finished the cereal bar. I brushed the crumbs from my jacket. I stood up, straightened my collar, and picked up my datapad. I checked the time. There were still 90 seconds of the courtesy window remaining, but I decided not to wait. I walked back to the door, pressed my palm to the reader, and stepped back into the grand hall of the Galactic Council 2 minutes before I was expected. Every pair of eyes, optical sensor and perception organ in that hall turned toward me. I crossed the floor. I did not go to my pedestal. I walked directly to the center of the room, where Voss Kalen stood, and I stopped 8 feet away from it. 3 of the arbiter's aides moved immediately, closing the distance, reaching for me. Protocol. A provisional representative does not approach the center. A provisional representative does not cross the floor uninvited. A provisional representative stands at the pedestal and speaks when addressed. I raised one hand and said quietly, "You are going to want to see this." I tapped my wrist link. The Grand Hall's main display system, a vast curved band of projection panels that ringed the upper walls of the chamber, accepted my data stream. It accepted it because, over 2 years of standing in this hall, I had spent a great deal of my free time learning exactly how the Council's public broadcast infrastructure worked, and I had spent 3 of those months obtaining the correct administrative access codes through means I will not detail here, except to say that they were not dramatic. The panels filled with data. Council Accord-class warship registry, real-time status indicators, 43 ships within 40 light-years of Voss Prime, standard fleet, standard patrol routes, fully operational. And then, one by one, the status indicators went gray. All 43 of them, in less than 8 seconds. Gray, offline, dark. The chamber did not explode into noise. That surprised me. What happened instead was a silence so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system in the walls. It was the silence of 43 species simultaneously experiencing something they had never experienced before, and having absolutely no framework with which to process it. Voss Kalen's frills had gone white. Not gold, not violet, not blue. White. I had read about white once in a very old xenobiology report about Voss Kalen physiology. White frills were involuntary. They indicated shock so complete that the being's emotional regulation system had simply stopped trying. It said, very quietly, "What have you done?" I met its 4 eyes steadily. "Nothing permanent," I said. Yet. Everything that came next would change the galaxy. But at that moment, in that silence, what I felt most clearly was not triumph, not fear, not even relief. What I felt was the particular, quiet satisfaction of knowing that my grandmother had been right. She had told me, years ago, when I was very young and very frightened of something I no longer remember, that the only way to be truly free is to make sure that the people holding your chair have more reason to let go than to hold on. I had spent my entire career building that reason. Now the council held it in their hands, and they did not know what to do with it. That, in the end, was the plan. 22 years, 3 months, and 11 days before I stood in the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council and watched a fleet go dark on a display screen. The first signal arrived from deep space. It reached Earth's radio telescope array in the Atacama Desert at 3:47 in the morning, local time. The technician on duty was a young man named Oliver Crane, 24 years old, fresh out of university, on his 3rd overnight shift that week, drinking terrible coffee from a thermos and reading a novel on his personal tablet. The alert sound was not dramatic. It was a small, plain tone, the same one that activated for equipment calibration checks. Oliver looked up from his novel, looked at his screen, looked away, looked back, and then sat very still for about 45 seconds before picking up the phone and calling his supervisor. The supervisor called the director. The director called Geneva. Geneva called every capital city on Earth. By morning, it was the largest coordinated government response in human history, and by the evening of the 2nd day, every major news channel on the planet was broadcasting the news under some variation of the same headline. We are not alone. Humanity celebrated for 3 weeks. There were parties in the streets of every city. There were concerts, speeches, ceremonies, declarations. Religious leaders gave sermons. Scientists gave interviews. Philosophers wrote long and excited essays. Children drew pictures of alien creatures in their school notebooks and taped them to the walls of their classrooms. It was the most collectively joyful 3 weeks in the recorded history of the human species. What nobody broadcast was the second message. It arrived 4 days after the first, on a different frequency, and it was received not by the public array in the Atacama, but by a military telescope facility in a mountain range in central Norway, operated by a Joint Defense Intelligence Unit, whose existence was not publicly acknowledged. The technicians who received it were not young and enthusiastic. They were middle-aged and security-cleared and deeply trained not to react visibly to unexpected things. They received the message, decoded it using the linguistic key included in the first transmission, printed it out on paper, put it in a classified envelope, and hand-delivered it to a woman named Admiral Patricia Howe in Oslo. Admiral Howe read it once. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly. Then she read it again. Then she picked up a secure telephone and called 6 people, and within 72 hours, a meeting took place in a basement room in Geneva, with no windows, no recording devices, and no official record of attendance. The second message was a list. 61 entries, each one a planetary coordinate, a species classification code, and a date. The dates ranged from 4,000 years ago to 47 years ago. The species classification codes, when cross-referenced with the linguistic database provided in the first transmission, all translated to the same status designation, sanctioned. Every one of those 61 coordinates corresponded to a star system where a species had achieved interstellar contact. Every one of those species was now gone, not relocated, not reformed, not re-educated. Gone. The Galactic Council had been operating an extinction protocol for 4,000 years, and some anonymous intelligence from somewhere within that ancient structure, had sent humanity a warning. I was 12 years old when the public first contact happened. I was 15 when my mother, who worked for the European Space Agency, sat me down and told me something she was not supposed to tell anyone. She had been briefed on the second message. She was part of a small circle of people who knew. She told me because she said she could not carry it alone, and because she trusted me, and because she thought I deserved to know what the world I was growing up in actually was. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. It changed everything about how I understood the Council's arrival. The celebrations in the streets, the speeches about unity, and the family of civilizations and humanity's bright future among the stars, all of it took on a different color. Not a hopeless color, not a dark one, but a very precise and clear color, like the tint of glass when you look through it at an angle and see the green hidden inside the transparent. I studied xenolinguistics because language is the architecture of intention. If you want to understand what a being truly means, you learn to hear not just the words, but the structure of the words, the choices, the silences. I studied the Council's public communications for 10 years. I listened to everything they said, and equally to everything they did not say. I mapped the patterns, and by the time I was 28, I understood something important. The Council was not malicious in the way a monster is malicious. It was not cruel for the pleasure of cruelty. It was afraid. It had been afraid for 4,000 years, and that fear had calcified into policy, and that policy had become procedure, and procedure had become bureaucracy, and bureaucracy does not ask itself whether it is wrong. It simply continues. The man who first told me about Project Fenris was named Dr. Conrad Elliott. He was a theoretical physicist at the University of Edinburgh, and he was 63 years old. And he had the kind of calm that comes from having spent 30 years thinking about problems so large that ordinary anxiety stops making sense in comparison. I met him at a classified briefing in 2041, when I was 32 years old, and had just been selected for the Earth Interstellar Diplomatic Service. Conrad sat across a table from me in a gray room, and slid a thin folder across the surface and said, "Read that, and then tell me what you think." The folder contained 30 pages of physics. It took me 4 hours to work through it, and I understood about 40% of it, which was apparently enough, because Conrad nodded when I looked up and said, "You see it." I saw it. What the folder described was the mechanism by which Council Accord-class warships maintained coherence across interstellar distances. Not propulsion, not weapons, not shields. Coherence. The ability of a ship's systems to remain integrated and functional when separated from their home network by light years of empty space. The ships used a technology the Council called quantum resonance threading. Without it, an Accord-class warship in deep space would begin experiencing cascading system failures within hours. Without it, a fleet was not a fleet. It was a collection of very expensive, very vulnerable debris. And what the 30 pages of physics described, in extraordinarily careful mathematical detail, was how to cut the thread. "How long did it take to develop this?" I asked. 11 years, Conrad said. 12 scientists. No external funding. No official project designation for the first 6 years. We worked on our own time, in our own labs, using equipment we borrowed, or repurposed, or built ourselves. He paused. We called it Fenris, after the old Norse mythological wolf that was bound in chains by the gods because they were afraid of what it would become. He looked at me steadily. The gods were right to be afraid. That did not make the chains just. Project Fenris, as I came to understand it over the following months of deep briefing, was not a weapons program in any conventional sense. It produced no bombs, no projectiles, no energy weapons. What it produced was a device about the size and weight of a large briefcase, which contained a quantum signal emitter capable of broadcasting on the exact resonance frequency used by Council threading technology. The emitter, when activated, did not destroy anything. It simply interrupted the thread. It introduced a disruption in the frequency, and a ship that lost its coherence thread did not explode. It simply shut down. Everything went dark. The crew survived, if they had emergency life support. The ship itself was physically intact, but it was functionally dead in space, as helpless as a building with all its electricity cut, and restarting it required a reset procedure that took between 40 and 70 hours under the best conditions. One device could drop one ship. 312 devices, networked together and activated simultaneously, could drop every Council warship within 40 light-years of Voss Prime in under 10 seconds. The network had taken 8 years to place. It was the longest, quietest, most patient operation in the history of human intelligence work, and it was carried out by 12 scientists, a handful of diplomatic couriers, and a network of cargo shipping companies that had no idea what they were transporting. I was one of 3 people who knew the locations of all 312 devices. The morning I received my appointment as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council, Conrad sent me a message. It was a single sentence. It said, "Remember that the goal is never to use it." I thought about that sentence every day for 2 years. I thought about it the morning I ate powdered eggs in the anteroom and read a death warrant for my species and sent one word to Earth. I thought about it while the fleet went dark on the display panels. I thought about it while I stood 8 feet from the most powerful being in the known galaxy and watched its frills go white with shock. The goal was never to use it. The goal was to reach the moment where using it was no longer necessary, because the other side understood that it could be used. The goal was the demonstration, not the consequence. The goal was to arrive at a table where both sides could leave freely. Conrad had also told me, once, over coffee in a small Edinburgh cafe, that the most important thing about holding a very powerful card is the willingness to play it, not the desire to play it. The willingness. There is a difference, he said. Desire is about wanting something to happen. Willingness is about understanding that it might have to, and accepting that, and being at peace with it before the moment arrives. "Are you at peace with it?" I had asked him. He had looked out the window at the gray Edinburgh sky for a long time before answering. "I am at peace with the 61 worlds," he said finally. "If they had been us, I would want someone to have tried." I thought about that answer on the floor of the Grand Hall, watching Voss Kalen's white frills, listening to the silence of a chamber full of species, who had just discovered that the smallest, youngest, most provisional member of their assembly had quietly, patiently, and without any announcement whatsoever, turned off their entire military capacity. I thought, Conrad is going to be insufferably satisfied when I tell him how this went. And then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the second document, the one I had brought from Earth, the one that had been drafted and revised and debated for 3 years by a committee of diplomats, scientists, philosophers, and representatives of every nation on Earth. I placed it on the floor between myself and Voss Kalen. I did not hand it to an aide. I did not transmit it to the display system. I placed it on the floor, physically, and stepped back. "High Arbiter," I said, "I believe this is the correct moment for Earth's formal response." The silence stretched another long second. Then Voss Kalen's frills moved. The white was fading. What replaced it was something I had never seen in the color chart, a pale, shifting silver, like the surface of water in early morning light. I did not know what silver meant. I would have to look it up later. What I did know was that 43 member species were watching, and every single one of them was recalculating something very significant. That was the real weapon, not the devices, not the fleet going dark. The recalculation. The moment when every ancient, powerful civilization in the room looked at the young provisional species standing alone on the floor, without a chair or a pedestal or a single ally, and understood, for the first time, that they had been wrong about what we were. They had looked at us and seen something small and frightened and controllable. What we actually were was something that had spent its entire existence being the most frightened creature in every room it had ever occupied, and had learned, over thousands of years of that experience, to build very carefully in the dark. I had one more cereal bar in my other pocket, oat and cranberry this time. I was saving it for after, assuming there was an after. I was quietly confident there would be. The silence in the grand hall lasted long enough that I started to count seconds in my head. I got to 19 before something broke it, and it was not Vos Kalen. It was a sound from the far left sector of the chamber, where the delegation of a species called the Veth Oru was seated. The Veth Oru are among the oldest member species in the council. They arrived in this chamber more than 4,000 years ago, which means they have been watching the proceedings of this assembly since before the Galactic Accord itself was drafted. They are not large beings, physically. They look, to a human eye, somewhat like very tall, very thin gray herons, with long folded limbs and heads that tilt constantly, as if always listening to something just beyond the range of normal hearing. In council sessions, they are almost always silent. In the 2 years I had been attending these proceedings, I had never once heard a member of the Veth Oru delegation speak on the open floor. The sound was a chair moving. One of the Veth Oru was standing up. Every sensor and eye and perception organ in the room that had been pointed at me shifted. The being that had stood was old, visibly old, even by the standards of a species that lived for millennia, its gray feathers gone almost entirely white, its folded limbs trembling faintly with the effort of standing upright. It did not look at me. It looked at Vos Kalen. The translation in my earpiece came through a half-second after it spoke, the way it always did with Veth Oru, whose language ran at a different temporal speed than most council languages. "She is right," it said. "We should have listened to the Tharasi. We should have listened to the Morvek. We should have listened to all of them." Then it sat back down. The chamber erupted. Not loudly, not with sound, because many of the species in the room did not communicate in ways that produced noise. But there was a wave of motion, a visible convulsion of postures and colors and signals that moved through the assembled delegations like a wind through tall grass, and within 30 seconds, the grand hall had broken into what I can only describe as organized chaos. Aides were moving. Delegations were clustering together in urgent communication. 3 of the smaller species had activated privacy screens around their areas, and were clearly speaking among themselves in whatever mode of communication they preferred. The Sheth aides who managed the floor were attempting to restore procedural order and failing visibly. Vos Kalen's frills had not moved since the Veth Oru elder spoke. They were still silver. I picked up the document from the floor. I stepped back to my pedestal, because I did not want to push the breach of protocol further than necessary. I had made the point I needed to make. Now I needed to be patient. Patience, in my experience, is not a passive thing. People tend to describe patience as the act of waiting. I think of it as the act of remaining completely ready, while appearing to be still. I stood at my pedestal with my hands flat on its surface, and my eyes moving slowly around the room, reading every signal I could find. What I read was this. The council was not a monolith. I had known that in theory for 2 years, but what I was seeing now was the practical reality of it. There were species in this room who were furious, whose body language screamed outrage, who were making signals toward the Arbiter's station that clearly meant restore order and deal with this immediately. There were others who were very quiet, very still, not looking at me or at Vos Kalen, but at each other, and those quiet, still conversations were the ones I watched most carefully. And there was the Veth Oru delegation, who had returned to their usual posture of absolute stillness, and whose elder had said 6 words that had changed the temperature of the entire room in a way I had not predicted and could not yet fully interpret. The Tharasi, the Morvek. I knew those names. Every xenohistory database I had ever accessed listed them as extinct, former member species, sanctioned. Their coordinates were 2 of the 61 entries on the list that had been delivered in secret 22 years ago. But that was all I knew. The Council's records on sanctioned species were sealed. The official position was that those species had posed threats to galactic stability and had been removed in accordance with the Accord. No details, no evidence, no external review. What the Veth Oru elder had said suggested that there was a great deal more to know. The session was officially suspended when Vos Kalen raised one long limb and broadcast the procedural suspension tone through the hall's speaker system. Delegations were directed to their private consultation areas. I was escorted, politely but firmly, back to the anteroom. I sat in the gray chair, and I contacted Earth. The connection opened in 4 seconds. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Director Philip Ashford, who ran the Earth Interstellar Defense Consortium from an office building in Geneva that looked from the outside like a moderately successful insurance company. Philip was 55 years old, had the energy of someone 20 years younger, and was one of 6 human beings on Earth who knew the complete picture of what we had built. Status, he said. Fleet is dark, I said. Council is in internal crisis. There is a fracture in the membership that I did not know about and that our intelligence did not flag. The Veth-Oru elder just stood up and said we should have listened to the Tharasi and the Morvek. A pause. That is unexpected. Yes, I need everything we have on the Veth-Oru. Everything. And I need whatever fragments exist on the Tharasi and Morvek species. I know the files are thin. I need them anyway. Give me 20 minutes. I have whatever time the council takes to argue among themselves. Could be an hour. Could be 3 days. I am currently eating oat and cranberry cereal bars and practicing not looking nervous. You never look nervous, Philip said. It is one of your more unsettling qualities. I am always nervous, I said. I am simply organized about it. The files came through 40 minutes later, and I read them in the anteroom while the council argued behind a closed door 30 meters away. The Veth-Oru file was extensive because they were an active member species, and we had been building their profile for 2 decades. The Tharasi and Morvek files were almost nothing. Fragments of astronomical data, a handful of intercepted transmissions from the early contact period, some secondary references in council historical documents that our analysts had parsed for mentions of extinct species. But there was one document that stopped me. It was a partial transcript, intercepted and partially decoded by our intelligence division 7 years ago, from a council archive access event. Someone inside the council system had attempted to retrieve a sealed file related to the Tharasi species and had been blocked. The block itself had generated a notification, which our people had caught. The transcript of the failed access attempt was largely administrative, but the system had logged the access credentials of the being who tried. The credentials belonged to a Veth-Oru research account. The elder who stood up in the chamber today had been trying to access those files for at least 7 years. I set down the datapad and sat very still for a moment, thinking. There is a particular feeling I have learned to recognize over the years. It is not quite excitement and not quite fear. It is the feeling of understanding, that something much larger than you thought you were standing in is actually visible, and that you have been inside it without knowing, and that the shape of it is both more complicated and more significant than any model you built. It is the feeling of seeing the whole picture instead of the part you had access to. I sent a message to Philip, 3 words, find out everything. Then I asked the aide stationed outside the anteroom whether it would be possible to request a brief private meeting with a member of the Veth-Oru delegation. The aide, a young Sheth who had been unfailingly polite to me since my appointment, despite having no professional obligation to be, looked at me with an expression that I had come to read as surprised curiosity. It would be highly irregular, it said, in the careful, slightly formal English it had learned specifically to communicate with me. I know, I said. Please ask anyway. The meeting was granted. It took place in a side chamber off the main corridor, a small room with walls of the same dark rock as the rest of the asteroid, lit by soft ambient panels that gave everything a warm, amber tone. The elder Veth-Oru was already seated when I entered, or rather it was arranged in the particular fold of limbs that served the Veth-Oru as a seated position, its long head tilted toward me at that constant listening angle. An attendant placed something warm in my hands, a cup of liquid that steamed gently and smelled like pine resin and rain after a long dry summer. I drank it carefully. It was sweet and faintly bitter at the same time, and it was one of the most pleasant things I had tasted since leaving Earth. The elder's name, I had been told by the aide, translated from Veth-Oru into English most closely as Sothan, though this was an approximation. Apparently the literal meaning was something like the one who carries the count of years without forgetting. The aide had said this in a tone that suggested it was an important distinction, and that I should treat the being before me with appropriate weight. I sat down across from Sothan, which was also irregular, because I was provisional, and it was a full member, but at this point, I had already broken several significant protocols today, and one more seemed manageable. I heard what you said, I told it. In the hall. Sothan's head tilted a fraction further. When it spoke, the translation came through the small earpiece I wore, a half-second delay, its voice rendered as something like wind through hollow reeds. I know you did, it said. I said it so that you would. That took a moment to settle. I looked at it carefully. You were speaking to me. I was speaking to the chamber, Sothan said. But yes, also to you. I have been waiting for a species to arrive at this table, with enough capability to make that statement worth making. Several came close. None of them managed to reach the moment before the council moved to prevent it. I felt the back of my neck prickle. The 61 worlds. 61, Sothan confirmed. Though the true number, if you were to count the species that were prevented from reaching interstellar capacity, through what the council terms pre-contact intervention, is considerably higher. The 61 are the ones who made it to the table. I breathed slowly. The council kills species that are not yet strong enough to fight back, and then it kills the ones that are strong enough before they become too strong. It is the logic of fear, Sothan said, without inflection, in a way that suggested it had said this thought many times, perhaps for centuries, and had long stopped feeling anything but tired about it. 4,000 years ago, a species called the Tharasi developed a technology not unlike what you have built. The council of that era attempted to sanction them before they could deploy it. The council failed. The war that followed lasted 8 centuries. 11 civilizations did not survive it. I sat with that number. 11 civilizations. Not 11 species. 11 civilizations, which meant not just the beings themselves, but everything they had built and known and remembered and created over the span of their existence. The Accord, I said slowly, was written after that war. The Accord, Sothan said, was written by the survivors of that war, who were afraid, and who decided that the only way to prevent another such war was to ensure that no new species ever reached the level of capability that made the Tharasi dangerous. The reed-wind voice paused for a moment. They believed they were protecting the galaxy. Some of them even believed they were protecting the young species they sanctioned. The logic was that a species capable of threatening the council was a species capable of causing a catastrophe. Better to remove the threat early than to risk another 8 centuries of destruction. And the Veth Oru opposed this, I said. We have opposed it for 2,000 years. We are outvoted. We have always been outvoted. The species that survived the Tharasi War are numerous, and they remember, and memory held long enough becomes terror, and terror held long enough becomes policy. Sothan was quiet for a moment. I have watched 61 species arrive at this table with hope. I have watched 61 sets of lights go out. I have been in this hall for 4,000 years, and I have never been able to stop it. I looked at the being across from me, this ancient, patient intelligence that had been carrying this grief for longer than human civilization had existed, and I felt something very clear and very deep settle into place. You sent the second message, I said, 22 years ago, the list of 61 worlds. Sothan was still for a long moment. Then it said, there are those within the council who have long believed that the correct approach is transparency, that if young species knew what they were facing, some of them might survive it. The message was sent by parties I will not name, at great personal risk, as an act of what I can only describe as hope. It worked, I said. Yes, Sothan said. It appears that it did. We sat together for a while in the amber light of that small room, and I thought about Conrad Eliot in Edinburgh, and about Philip Ashford in Geneva, and about Oliver Crane looking up from his novel at 3 a.m. in the Atacama, and about my grandmother Elena, and about 11 billion people on a small blue planet who had spent 22 years preparing, very carefully, for this exact morning. Then I thought about the 11 civilizations lost in the Tharasi War. I thought about what we were, a species that had spent most of its recorded history in conflict with itself, a species that had come within hours, more than once, of ending its own existence with weapons of its own making, a species that had only very recently, and very expensively, learned some basic truths about how to share a planet without destroying it, a species that was now, somehow, standing in the most powerful governing body in the galaxy, having just disabled a fleet, holding a proposal for restructuring the entire Accord. Maybe, I thought, the Council's fear was not completely unreasonable. And then I thought, it does not matter. A fear, however reasonable it might be, is not a license to erase 61 civilizations. The danger that we might cause harm does not justify the certainty of harm done to us. The Accord was the logic of people who had survived a catastrophe, and decided that the solution was to prevent anyone from ever being powerful enough to cause another one. It was a logical solution. It was also a solution that required the ongoing destruction of civilizations to maintain. And any system that requires the routine ending of innocent species to continue functioning is not a system of protection. It is a system of control dressed up in the language of protection, and the difference between the two is the most important distinction in any form of governance. I picked up my data pad. I sent a second message to Earth. 2 words this time. Hold. Ready. Not fire. Not withdraw. Hold. Stay exactly as you are, completely prepared, and wait for me to tell you what comes next. Then, I looked at Sothan. I would like to go back into that hall, I said, and I think I would like to have an ally when I do. Sothan's head tilted. What you are proposing will not be accepted easily. There are members of this council who will resist it vigorously. There are members who have built their entire sense of safety on the existing structure. You are asking them to dismantle the wall they hid behind after the worst thing that ever happened to them. I know, I said. It may take a very long time. I know that too. And you are willing to stand in that hall, without a chair, for as long as it takes? I thought about the gray pedestal, and the word provisional stamped on the access record. Every time I entered the building, I thought about sitting down in a chair that was technically still temporary, for 30 seconds. Before being pulled back into a room full of beings who needed to shake my hand, or whatever the equivalent was for their particular arrangement of limbs. I will stand for as long as I need to, I said, and then I will sit down. Sothan made a sound I had not heard before, low and rhythmic, like water moving over smooth stones. The aide outside the door later told me, when I asked, that it was the sound the Vethoru made when they experienced something they had waited a very long time to feel. It was, as far as anyone had been able to determine, the closest equivalent their language had to laughter. The emergency session lasted 11 days. I slept in the anteroom. I slept in the gray chair, wrapped in a thermal blanket that the young Sheth aide brought me on the second day without my asking, which I considered one of the kindest acts of the entire experience. I ate the last of my cereal bars on day 3. After that, the same aide began bringing me food from the council's general provisions kitchen, which served about 40 different dietary requirements, and managed, impressively, to make everything taste only slightly better than nothing. I ate it gratefully. I had long passed the point of being selective. For 11 days, I was not in the chamber. The council's emergency procedures required closed deliberation, meaning only full member species were permitted inside. I was provisional. I waited outside. This was, I want to be clear, an absolutely miserable 11 days. I spent a great deal of it reading. Philip sent me updated files every few hours, some of it new intelligence, some of it background material I had requested, some of it messages from people on Earth who had been briefed on the situation and wanted to say something, even if they could not say it publicly. My mother sent me a message on day 4 that said simply, "I am very proud of you, and also extremely frightened, and also your uncle wants to know if you have eaten anything." I replied that I had eaten something, and that it was approximately food. Conrad sent me a message on day 6 that was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph contained a careful and detailed analysis of the political dynamics that his team had been modeling from the data I had sent back. The second paragraph was a very gentle and very thorough explanation of why the next phase of negotiation, if we reached it, would be more technically complex than the first. The third paragraph said, "For what it is worth, I think you handled the moment correctly, and I would like to buy you a proper meal in Edinburgh when this is over, in a restaurant with actual food on actual plates." I read that third paragraph 4 times. On day 7, Sothan sent me a message through the Vethoru internal system, which it had routed through channels that technically should not have been accessible to someone of my provisional status. The message was brief. It said, "The debate is shifting. There are 3 additional member species who have formally requested access to the sealed Thorasi archives. This has not happened in 4,000 years." I read that and sat very quietly for a while. On day 9, an aide brought me a new chair. Not a grand chair, not a permanent chair, just a slightly better chair than the gray one I had been sleeping in, with armrests and slightly more supportive cushioning. There was no official note with it, no explanation of who had sent it. I used it gratefully and did not ask questions. On day 11, at approximately 6 in the morning by my personal timekeeping, the chamber doors opened. I was awake. I had been awake for 2 hours, sitting in the new chair with a cup of the Sheth aide's resin and rain tea, reading the same paragraph of a xenolinguistics paper, over and over, without absorbing any of it, because I was too busy listening to every sound from the corridor. When I heard the mechanical click of the door seal releasing, I was on my feet before the sound had finished. The aide appeared in the doorway. Its large pale eyes were steady, and its expression was the careful neutral I had come to understand as deliberately professional. "Ambassador Solis," it said, "the council is ready to reconvene." I put down the tea. I straightened my jacket. I found, after 3 months of daily wearing, that the jacket had taken on the particular comfortable wrinkled quality of a thing that has been through something significant and survived it. I decided this was appropriate. I walked back into the grand hall of the Galactic Council. The chamber looked the same as it always did. Dim amber light from the red dwarf. The curved sweep of projection panels on the upper walls. 43 delegations in their designated areas. The arbiter's central position occupied by Voss Kalen, who stood as it always did, frills moving in slow rhythms. The frills were not white. They were not silver. They were a blue so deep it was almost black. A color I had not seen before. I would need to look it up. I added it to the list of things to investigate when this was over, along with the meaning of the faint, repeated clicking sounds that 3 of the other delegations were making, and whether the Sheth aide's name was actually pronounceable by human vocal cords, because I had been too polite to try, and I felt I owed it an attempt. I walked to my pedestal. Voss Kalen spoke. It did not address me first. It addressed the chamber. It spoke for 12 minutes in its own language, the translation running in my ear, and what it said was the most significant piece of political speech I had ever heard, because it was a very long, very carefully worded, and very obvious admission that the Galactic Council had been wrong. It did not use the word wrong. It used phrases like course correction and updated understanding and the necessity of revision in light of new information. It spoke about the Tharasi War with a care that told me the topic had been formally introduced into the deliberations for the first time. It mentioned the 61 worlds, not by name, not with the detail they deserved, but it mentioned them. It said that the Accord, as originally drafted, had served a specific purpose, in a specific historical moment, and that the Council was prepared to examine whether that purpose remained valid in its current form. Examination, not reform, not apology, not justice, examination. I had expected this. I had built my entire strategy around the understanding that you do not get everything in one session. You get the door open. The door, today, was open. Voss Kalen turned to me. Its frills pulsed. The deep blue held. "Ambassador Solis, the Council has considered the documents submitted by the Earth Interstellar Diplomatic Service." It paused for a single breath. "The Council is prepared to enter formal negotiation on the terms outlined therein, subject to the conditions of mutual good faith and reciprocal transparency, as agreed in closed session." Mutual good faith, reciprocal transparency, both sides freely at the table. My grandmother's words, translated into the formal language of 4,000 years of galactic governance. "Earth accepts," I said. I heard, from the far left of the chamber, a sound like water over smooth stones. The negotiations that followed took 8 months. They were not simple. They were not always peaceful. There were sessions that ended in procedural deadlock, and sessions that ended in what I can only describe as controlled crisis. And there was one session, on a day when 3 of the more resistant member species simultaneously withdrew from the process and then returned to it 6 hours later, that I sat in the anteroom and thought very carefully about whether I was actually capable of doing what I had spent 7 years preparing to do. I decided I was, not because I was certain of the outcome, because the alternative was to leave, and leaving meant the door closed again, and a closed door meant another entry on the list of 61 worlds, and I was not willing to be that entry. Philip flew up to Voss Prime on month 3. He was the first additional human being to enter the Grand Hall, under a temporary consultation credential that had never been used before, and required 3 separate procedural precedents to be established before it was valid. He sat in the anteroom with me and we reviewed documents for 8 hours straight, and he was exactly as focused and competent as I needed him to be. And at the end of the 8 hours he said, quietly, "I think we are going to manage this." "I think so too," I said. "Conrad wants to know if you got his message about the Edinburgh dinner. Tell him I am holding him to it." The final terms took another 5 months to agree. I will not detail every point, because the full text runs to 460 pages, and most of it concerns mechanisms, procedures, and review processes that require substantial contextual knowledge to fully appreciate. The summary is this. The sanction protocol was suspended permanently, pending a formal review process, that would require a supermajority of the full council membership to reinstate, a threshold that had never been reached in 4,000 years, even for measures that had widespread support. The provisional species classification was dissolved. Any species that had achieved interstellar contact and sought membership in the council was to be offered full membership status with equal voting weight, subject to a standard induction process that did not include any capability assessment related to defense technologies. A formal inquest was established to investigate the circumstances of the 61 sanctioned worlds. Sothan was appointed as its first chair. The inquest had powers of subpoena over sealed council archives, which meant that for the first time in 4,000 years, someone with authority and purpose was going to look at what had actually happened to 61 civilizations. The inquest could not bring those civilizations back. It could not undo what had been done to them. What it could do was make sure the full record existed, and that the full record was visible to every member species, and that the logic of what had been done was examined openly and honestly and permanently. Project Fenris was, as I had proposed, made open to every member species. The physics was shared in full. Every species that wanted it received the complete research data, the device specifications, and the theoretical framework underlying both. Every species that wanted to build their own network could do so. No species would ever again be able to quietly disarm another without mutual vulnerability to the same outcome. The 12 scientists of Project Fenris were not handed over to anyone. They were invited to present their research at the first Joint Council Earth Scientific Symposium, which took place 6 months after the final terms were signed. I was not present for the symposium because I was in another set of negotiations at that point, but Philip attended, and he sent me a message afterward that said simply, "Conrad was exactly as smug as you predicted," and also he started crying halfway through the presentation and pretended he had something in his eye. I received a chair. Not a grand chair, not a symbolic one, not one with any particular ceremonial weight. A plain chair, positioned at a new section of the council floor that had been established for full Earth representation, next to the Veth Oru delegation area, which Sothan had quietly arranged and which I found deeply touching. The chair had been there, I was told, since day 2 of the final round of negotiations, delivered without ceremony or announcement, simply placed in position by someone who had decided it was time. On the day the final terms were formally signed, I sat in that chair for 30 seconds. Then I had to stand up again to greet the 17 delegations that wanted to formally acknowledge the new terms, which took 4 hours and involved an astonishing variety of physical gestures that I did my best to mirror appropriately. The Sheth aide, my aide, helped me through most of it with the kind of patient professionalism that I had come to rely on, and would eventually, I hoped, find a way to properly thank. I stood in that hall for a long time that day, long past the formal proceedings, long past the point where the last delegation had gone back to their consultation areas. I stood and looked at the chamber that had been built to make young species feel small, in the dim reddish light of a dying star, chosen deliberately to make visitors feel the weight of time, and I felt something that was not triumph, and not relief, and not even happiness, exactly. It was more like the feeling of arriving home after a very long journey to a place that has changed while you were gone, and finding that the changes are, on balance, improvements, and that the people inside are glad to see you, and that there is somewhere to sit down. I thought about my grandmother Elena. I thought about what she would say if she could see this hall, this chamber, this strange and magnificent gathering of impossible beings. I thought she would find it extraordinary and funny and overwhelming and deeply, humanly significant. I thought she would ask immediately whether I had eaten enough, and then she would look at the chair, and she would understand, without needing it explained, exactly what that chair meant. I thought about Oliver Crane, who was now 39 years old and had spent the last 12 years working in deep space communications, and still, according to every interview he had ever given, remembered exactly how the alert had sounded at 3:47 in the morning in the Atacama. I thought about what he would say when this news reached him. I thought he would probably sit very still for about 45 seconds, like he had that first morning, before picking up his phone. I thought about Conrad in Edinburgh, almost certainly already planning the Edinburgh dinner in considerable detail, almost certainly including a spreadsheet. And I thought about all of them, all 11 billion, going about their lives on a small blue planet, 38 light-years from where I was standing, most of them unaware of the specific texture of what had just been decided on their behalf. All of them, the descendants of every person who had ever looked at a situation that seemed impossible, and decided to try anyway. People ask me, When I get back to Earth and give talks and do interviews and sit in rooms with journalists and government officials and students in university lecture halls, whether I was afraid in that chamber, whether the moment the fleet went dark and the chamber went silent, and the most powerful being in the known galaxy looked at me with white frills, was the moment I thought I might have made a catastrophic mistake. I tell them the truth, which is yes. I was terrified. I was terrified in the anteroom with the cereal bar, and I was terrified walking back into the chamber 2 minutes early, and I was terrified placing the document on the floor, and I was terrified for 11 days in a gray chair outside a door I was not allowed through. But fear, I have come to understand, is not an obstacle. Fear is information. Fear tells you the situation is serious, and that you should pay attention. The mistake is to treat fear as an instruction, to let it tell you not what to notice, but what to do. Fear said, "This matters enormously." Fear said, "The stakes are real and permanent." Fear said, "Be careful, and be ready, and be honest about how much you do not know." Fear did not say, "Stop." I have spent enough time in rooms where the beings holding power were afraid of what we might become to understand something fundamental. They were right. We are capable of causing enormous harm. We have caused enormous harm, to each other and to our own world, and the history of our species contains enough tragedy to fill libraries. Any honest accounting of humanity includes that record. It does not exclude it. What it also includes is everything else. Every person who looked at something broken and tried to fix it. Every mind that looked at a wall and started calculating the door. Every generation that took what the previous one had learned and went further with it, sometimes wisely and sometimes not, but always further. The Council built its system on fear. It looked at the Tharasi War and decided that the solution was a lock, and that the lock needed to be maintained forever, at whatever cost. It is a very human kind of mistake, actually. The kind that comes from looking at one terrible outcome and structuring your entire existence around preventing exactly that one thing, even when the prevention becomes its own form of harm. We are not a perfect species. We are not even close to perfect. We are a species that spent thousands of years trying to figure out how to share a planet, and mostly failed, and occasionally succeeded, and eventually, very slowly, got somewhat better at it. We arrived in the galaxy still in the middle of that process. We will be in the middle of that process for a very long time. But here is the thing I know. The 61 worlds on that list were not dangerous. They were not threats. They were species that reached toward the stars with the same combination of wonder and ambition and anxiety that every thinking being carries. And they were ended before they ever had the chance to show what they would become. We will never know what they would have built. We will never hear their music, or read their thoughts, or understand how they describe the experience of being alive. That is an irreversible loss, and no negotiation, and no inquest, and no formal record will undo it. What we can do is what we have always done with irreversible losses. We can learn, we can make the record, we can ensure that the logic that caused the harm is exposed, and examined, and changed. We can build something that makes it harder to happen again. Not impossible, harder. I sat in my chair on the council floor, and breathed the recycled air of an asteroid, orbiting a dying star, and thought about all of this. And I thought about the door that was now open. And I thought that open doors are fragile, and require constant maintenance, and will be tested many times, and may swing closed again, and will have to be pushed open again if they do. And then I thought about the specific texture of oat and honey cereal bars, and about Edinburgh restaurants with actual food on actual plates, and about the chair my mother used to sit in when she worked late in the evenings, and about the sound of water over smooth stones, and about the peculiar, stubborn, unkillable thing that lives in the center of every human being I have ever known. We build in the dark, we reach anyway. We are afraid, and we go forward, and we carry the weight of what we have done, and we try to do better, and we do not stop. That is not a threat. That is just what we are.